Candace Savage has written a book called Strangers in the House. It's just been released, and we've invited Candace today to give us some insight into the book and the story behind it. Candace, thank you again for coming on the show.
Oh, my pleasure.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and the background of how this book started.
Well, it all started about 30 years ago when I bought a house. Nice little house. I always have loved it. But we lived there for several years before we had any idea that it might have a story to tell. One day, my then quite young daughter was taken to the local history room at the public library, and she came home with this little scrap of paper, which being a pack rat I still have, on which in pencil she'd written the names of all the heads of household ever to live at our house. And so it goes back through the decades to 1928. The names are interesting, anonymous, all male, of course, because that's the way records are kept or were kept. But there at the very beginning, 1928, it says Blondin, Napoleon S. And so we thought, this is interesting. We're in Nutana. All the other names had looked vaguely Anglo. And here's this very French name at the beginning of this story. So put it away. Then a few years later, we did some renovations in our kitchen. And of course, there's this absolute blizzard of wood shavings, the sad excuse for insulation that's in the rest of the walls in our house. And they all come falling down and fill up the entire room. But in and amongst all this debris, there's more debris. There's the collar of a man's shirt. There's pages from books, recipes for frosting. There's pages of children's arithmetic exercises, bits of Valentine's with little cryptic rhyme about who might I be, and then also the lid from a box that had once held modeling clay. And it took me years before I realized that on it someone had written Ralph Blondin. So all this stuff that had been in the walls actually connected back to that first family. And I like to think that, like to imagine that the kids went to school and they said, "Sorry, teacher, the house ate my homework," because there it was in the walls. Anyway, oh yes, and there were 3 photographic negatives in there. Few years later, so again, I put all this stuff away. A few years later, I pull it all out, and I decide that those photographic negatives are so disgusting and dirty that I throw them away. So I still have one. And then years and years later, I'm reading a book about the history of Western Canada and Métis experience in Western Canada, and there's that name again, Napoleon Blondin. And so I start to wonder what kind of a magic portal this little house might be. Like, what story does it have to tell? So away I went.
And you started the research on the family name and uncovered some things. So at what time, when was that? You said 30 years ago that you bought the house, so you started some renovations later.
Yeah, so about 6 or 7 years ago, I started doing that research.
And with the family name, what did you uncover?
Well, because for French Canadians, genealogy is really important marker of belonging. If you belong to certain family lines, then you really are, Québécois or Québécoise or French Canadian. And so the records are kept very meticulously. So at first I fell down the rabbit hole called Ancestry.ca. I mean, you go down there and you might be there for the rest of your life, wandering around. But there are, fortunately for people of French Canadian, Quebec ancestry, there are very, very clean sources of information. And so you can trace this family back to France and to a particular, at least that family name, a particular man who signed a contract in the 16 or 1700s to come across and work and on construction in Montreal in the very beginnings of New France. So this family turned out not to be Métis, but to have that lineage all the way back through French Canada. Of course, they did, as many people of French and Canadian ancestry do. They did have Métis cousins. And some of those cousins lived at Round Prairie. So there was another connection with the Saskatoon story. This particular branch of the family, you could trace them coming from France into New France, then moving all around there, always just kind of one step behind the main chants, never quite getting well established. Then in the 19th century, at the end of the 19th century, moving into Franco, Ontario, around the Great Lakes, and then from there eventually coming to Harris, Saskatchewan, and homesteading, and then moving into Saskatoon. They moved into Saskatoon in the winter of 1927, which was just after the Ku Klux Klan had arrived in Saskatchewan on an anti-French, anti-Catholic platform. And so as I was doing the genealogical research, a really amazing thing happened. I was leaving little digital footprints, asking questions and things, and the husband of a granddaughter of this family noticed and contacted me. And so the next thing I knew, here are these two granddaughters. They remembered that their grandfather had built a house in Saskatoon. They knew he'd lost it. But then they'd lost track of it. They didn't know where it was. And so here they are. They show up. They've got family albums. Here's a picture of what I think is my house being built. Here are the three of the Blondin children, including their father, Ralph, from the autographed box. They're standing on the boulevard. Here's a picture of their grandfather driving down the street, 2 blocks up. And then they also tell me stories, and they tell me that their grandmother, whose name at birth was Clarisse Marie Perron, she was like Napoleon, her husband. Her lineage is French back to the beginning of France, just as long as there's been a French language, her people have been speaking French. She gets here, she refuses to speak or be spoken to in French, even in her own home. So what's that about? And so that's what led me to the Ku Klux Klan by way of the Orange Order.
And what was the discovery there in terms of the provincial impact and things that at that time were happening?
Well, I remember reading in history books that the English Canada wanted Western Canada, the prairies, to be set up in the image of Ontario. But I didn't really understand that in the image of Ontario meant white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. And so that was a part of the baggage that the people who, and I've always heard this phrase, dominant society, had really no idea what that meant. But, when you see it in action, it's the Protestant clergy, it's the members of the legislature, it's the chair of the local chambers of commerce, it's, the leading business people, and very, very many of them subscribe to this same ambition. They want the prairies to be white, Anglo-Saxon, and Protestant. And one of the organizations that helps them achieve that is the Orange Order, which we associate with the terrible, terrible sectarian violence in Ireland. They're the bad guys on the Protestant side who are, fife and drum, and their hatred of Catholics is electric. But in Western Canada, in English Canada, through the 20s, well into the 20th century, the Orange Order is very, very powerful. So it was fascinating to discover that at Harris, where they homesteaded, there were 12th of July parades. The 12th of July is the big orange celebration. So they had their fifes and their drums and their fancy banners, and they're marching, and people are coming from all the surrounding villages this way, that way, by train. One year they said they had 3,000 people, then 5,000 people. So here it all is, all around, all this celebration around hatred of Catholicism, please. So that was very, very surprising to me, and then even more surprising and painful to think about how that affected this family, who of course had been brought up Catholic, though they deviated from the true path. And then to find out how it had repercussions, those hatreds, had repercussions in my own family, because I knew that my grandfather, my maternal grandfather and grandmother, had argued about religion. But I didn't know that the Orange Order was, and all this nastiness
Part of that
was, mixed up in that. Then in 1926, the end of 1926, here comes the Ku Klux Klan, not directly from the U.S., as we might expect, but coming from Ontario, where they'd bombed a church and gotten into some trouble. So looking for a change of venue, they have operatives arrive here at the end of 1926, and they pick up the program that the Orange Order and other Protestant organizations had been nurturing all through the early years of settlement. So suddenly, it's not surprising at all that Clara Blondin is not Clarisse Marie Perron anymore, and she won't speak French.
Because of that environment at that
time.
Exactly.
Yes.
This is a fascinating insight into just a simple question about wondering who lived in the home before. And it's not that often, just as we close out, that an author has two books
I know, isn't
released,
it amazing?
But Hello Crow is also out there as well. Candace, I want to thank you for taking time out today and sharing that with us. Make sure you take a look at these. They're awesome, awesome books. Stay with us. We'll be right back.